Hello, class, and welcome to this lecture where we will be exploring the neurobiology of addiction in substance use and abuse and the social deviance associated with this. So, the first thing to kind of keep in mind is that there is a profound link between the brain and behavior and substance use, and addiction in all of its forms is something that has been there throughout history. And as we embark on this journey, I want you to just be mindful that we are dealing with something that is present in most everyone's life. You either know somebody that is struggling with addiction, or you are struggling with your own addiction in some way, shape, or form. There is a part of being human that there are certain things that we are kind of wired to be addicted to. And this can impact decision-making processes. And so it's a very human thing, but it can also go awry, and that is why it can be classified as a disorder. And so as we take a look at this, there are a few things that I want to kind of highlight here. First off, we're going to, as always, take a look at a few key researchers, but we'll also look at the neurobiology of addiction. What's the neurological foundation for addiction? What and why do substances interact with our brain and our neural pathways and reward system in order to create addictive behaviors? We'll dive into what are some of the decision-making processes and the decision-making mechanisms within the brain that can lead to addiction and cause some individuals to continue with addiction despite the negative outcomes. We'll also look a little bit at the classification of substance addictions and explore some of those areas, and then we'll dive into some specific addictions, specific substances, and the different types of addictions that come about from this. But as always, let's start with a researcher. And today we're going to discuss a little bit about Nora Volka and her insight and research into the field of addiction. Now, she was born in 1956 in Mexico City and became a prominent neuroscientist and psychiatrist. She got her medical degree from the National University of Mexico and then went on to do some additional psychiatric training at New York University and really dived into the field of that intersection between understanding neuroscience and the mechanisms of addiction. And as a result, she became the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And so has spent a good deal of the last 20 years being a leader in that field, empowering research initiatives for understanding the mechanisms associated with drug addiction and how it affects the brain. And a lot of her research and that she's kind of been involved with has focused on neuroimaging, specifically positron emission tomography, to look at the brain's reward system, the decision-making processes, and the overall functioning. And a lot of her work and the work of the teams that she's associated with have highlighted a few things that I want you to be mindful of. The first one is the very important role of the neurotransmitter dopamine that's associated with pleasure and reward. Her work has shown that drug abuse can dysregulate the dopamine signaling, leading to very compulsive drug-seeking behaviors. And so a lot of her work has really looked at, understanding these mechanisms, how they impact behavior, and then trying to put a human face on all of it, to destigmatize addiction, to understand that oftentimes people are victims of the neurochemical processes that have gone on within their brain. So that's a little bit about her. Now I want to kind of shift gears and look at, based upon some of her research and the research of people like her, of Nora Volka, how we can understand the neurobiology of addictions. The first thing to kind of be mindful of is that there are specific reward pathways within the brain. And so very central to addiction is the brain's reward pathway, the primary reward pathway that releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. And substance use, particularly addictive substances, trigger a surge of dopamine or mimic the function of dopamine and create a reinforcing effect that encourages repeat drug-seeking behaviors. And some chronic substance use induces a neuroplastic change in the brain, altering the connections between neurons and affecting the brain's ability to adapt to new experiences. You kind of get caught in this rigid pattern of thinking that enables the addictive behavior to continue to dominate an individual's life. So we need to kind of be mindful of that. The other thing is that there is a function within the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that is responsible for decision making and impulse control, and that undergoes some significant changes in individuals with substance use disorders. And so when you have someone that's living with substance use addictions, you often see this impaired judgment and this difficulty in resisting the urge to use substances despite the negative consequences. And a lot of that has to do with the prefrontal cortex dysfunction. And we'll talk about that a little more deeply as we go on with this lecture. But basically what you have, and the thing to kind of keep in mind, is that addictive substances often hijack the brain's natural reinforcement system, and it's tricking it into perceiving the substance as something that the brain needs to survive. And this can lead to a prioritization of drug-seeking behavior over other natural rewards that are actually supportive of the sustainment of the organism, of the individual. And so when you have this prolonged substance use, it can lead to the body adjusting and becoming tolerant to what is often normally a toxic substance, so that your body requires higher doses to achieve the same effect. And so when there is absence of that substance, it throws the system out of balance. And so there can be significant withdrawal symptoms, both physical and psychological. And this is going to further reinforce the cycle of addiction as these individuals seek to alleviate this discomfort. And so it's just really important that we understand this whole dysregulation of the system so that we can deal graciously with people that are suffering from these horrible addictions to substances. Now, I want to take a little bit of time now and look at, okay, when an individual suffering from substance use is making bad choices, why does this come about? And a lot of research has gone into this, and we see that individuals will make these choices for addiction despite knowing the potential negative consequences because of the functioning of a specific region of the prefrontal cortex called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this has to do with emotional responses that are associated with decisions. And you need to kind of remember that human beings aren't really rational beings. Every decision that we make has a huge emotional component to it. And in fact, if you didn't have emotions, you wouldn't really make any decisions because you wouldn't care, basically. So there's no need to make a decision if you don't care. So, and the ventromedial region of the prefrontal cortex plays a huge role in that connection between the emotions and the decision-making regions of your brain. And so, where is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex? Well, it's situated in the front of the brain, and because it's part of the prefrontal cortex, and it plays a pivotal role in decision-making processes. It integrates the emotional signals from other brain regions, specifically like the amygdala, with the cognitive processes that we use to guide our behavior. And emotions are these powerful influences of emotion, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex helps to regulate the emotional responses that we have that contribute to the assessment of things like risk and reward associated with any particular choice. And when there's a dysregulation of this area, there is obviously going to be a imbalance of the risk-reward decision-making process. And so you get a more impulsive decision-making process, which is the hallmark of addiction. So in individuals with substance use disorders, this ventromedial prefrontal cortex typically will exhibit this dysfunction, and this is going to impact their decision-making process, and they're going to prioritize immediate rewards over their long-term well-being, whereas a healthy individual that has a ventromedial prefrontal cortex that is working properly is going to prioritize long-term well-being over immediate rewards. Now, that's one thing. Then there's another thing that ties in with that, and that is the neurotransmitters and their involvement in this decision-making. So specifically dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine kind of tells you that things are safe and that there isn't danger. And dopamine gives you, serotonin tells you that things are safe and there's no danger, and dopamine tells you that there's a reward to happen. And each of these neurotransmitters also plays a role in that communication process with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so when substances disrupt or mimic those neurotransmitters, it can trick that decision-making process and leads to, again, more of these addictive kinds of behaviors that are going on within the individual. And so understanding that role of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in decision-making has some huge implications in addictions treatment. And so interventions aimed at restoring the balance in this brain region, and we can do this through some cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as addressing some of the maladaptive decision-making patterns, can go a long ways to helping someone kind of get back on their feet and make some good choices and have some support systems in place in order to help them to make good choices. Now, there are various substances that are identified within the DSM-5 that I want to kind of touch on each of these to explore a little bit of what they are, what they do. We won't dive into them very deeply, but I want to kind of touch on them at least so you have a good sense of how each of them works. Okay, so let's start off. We have many here. So we have alcohol use disorder, and that is typified by excessive and compulsive alcohol consumption, characterized by a lack of control, increased tolerance, and continued use despite the negative consequences. Then there's caffeine use disorder, and there you're looking at excessive and problematic use of caffeine that leads to distress or impairment in daily function. So while caffeine use is common, excessive intake can have some negative consequences. And there's cannabis use disorder, where it's characterized by impaired control, increased tolerance, and continued use despite it having negative consequences and effects on someone's life. Then there's hallucinogen use disorder. Again, continued impairment, disturbance of perceptual processing, and continued use despite the negative impact upon someone's life. There's inhalant use disorder, and this is inhalation of volatile substances that can significantly impair or stress and have some profound damage on the brain, and is often associated with a lack of control over its use. Then there's opioid use disorder, and this again is a big one. There's a problematic use of opioids, and this is going to include prescription painkillers as well as illicit substances like heroin. And so it's characterized by a range of symptoms, but some of the most common are cravings and change in tolerance, and then of course the famous withdrawal symptoms from it. There is also sedatives, hypnotics, anxiolytic use disorder, and this kind of a grab bag where you have, again, the physical and psychological dependence, tolerance, and continued use despite the negative consequences. There's stimulant use disorder, and this would include things like cocaine or amphetamines. And here again, tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, difficulty in controlling the use, and finally tobacco use disorder. And this is characterized by continued use despite a knowledge that it's associated with health risks and can cause some severe damage to the individual. So we'll maybe start with tobacco. And we'll look at a little bit of the use of this and how it can kind of impact someone socially as well as personal harm. So the first thing to kind of be mindful of here is nicotine, which is the primary addictive component in tobacco. And this acts on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain. And so this interaction leads to the release of dopamine, and that contributes to the reinforcing effects that underlie the addiction. Now, when you have chronic use of tobacco, this is going to lead to tolerance. So you're going to need to smoke more. You're going to need to consume higher levels of nicotine, have higher doses, in order to get the same emotional effects. And there's also going to be withdrawal symptoms causing irritability and cravings, and that's going to drive the use on. And then there's also some associative learning that plays a role in tobacco addiction, with the environmental clues often being linked to the rewarding effects of nicotine. And these cues can trigger cravings and contribute to some relapse within it. Now, tobacco use is really a leading cause of preventable disease, and this includes cardiovascular disease, respiratory disorders, and various types of cancer. And so the impact cannot be overstated, and this includes not just for the individual, but also secondhand smoke. And the economic toll of tobacco also has a huge impact because it encompasses healthcare costs, loss of productivity due to illness, and the societal burdens of caring for individuals with tobacco-related disorders. Now, there has been some significant social stigma and legal implications that have come up over the last few decades related to nicotine and tobacco use over the last few decades. And so that has played a bit of a role in curbing some of the use of this. Let's go on now and talk a little bit about stimulants. And this is stimulants like cocaine and amphetamines that exert really a powerful effect on the brain and leads to kind of a unique pattern of addiction as well as the associated harm with it. And stimulants are those that enhance the release of dopamine into the brain, and particularly the reward pathway. So there's a powerful impact, intense feeling of euphoria and pleasure that's associated with stimulant use. And the thing is, chronic use of stimulants can disrupt that delicate balance of the neurotransmitters and particularly affect dopamine and the dopaminergic system, but also other systems like norepinephrine and serotonin. And so a person can almost start to feel not normal unless they are on the stimulant, which is the point at which things become very severe. Because stimulants can hijack that brain's natural reward system. And so what would normally guide adaptive behavior through natural rewards gets hijacked, and so a person's role and function in society begins to get skewed and rigid. And because of that, stimulant use is sometimes associated with increased risk of violent behavior and criminal activity because the person is striving for that intense euphoria and they have decreased inhibitions, particularly when they're on stimulants, and this can induce increased impulsive and aggressive patterns. There can also be some mental health challenges that tie in with this, like anxiety or paranoia and hallucinations, because those, like the thing that kind of keeps you in touch with reality is having a good balance of your dopamine. So when you have too much dopamine, you can lose touch with reality. And this can cause some disintegration in your whole societal structure and the relationships that a person has. And that can cause a significant strain, obviously, in intimate relationships, employment difficulties, social isolation. And so there are some significant issues related to stimulants. Anxiolytics, sedatives, hypnotics, these work, like for example, anxiolytics like benzodiazepines, primarily act upon GABA, your gamma-aminobutyric acid, those kind of receptors in the brain. And by enhancing the inhibitory effects of GABA, these substances produce a calming effect. But that calming effect can be so profound that it can become addictive, where someone doesn't feel okay unless they are almost in a semi-comatose state. And that can be profoundly dangerous, particularly when you have someone being exposed to the elements, because they become basically oblivious to everything around them. And there can be development of tolerance requiring higher and higher doses of the desired effect, and the dependence also results in withdrawal symptoms that can continue the use. And as with any substance, these anxiolytics can disrupt that delicate balance in the neurotransmitters, particularly in this case, GABA and glutamate. And so that can also disrupt the decision-making process. And when you combine these anxiolytics with other common substances, say, for example, alcohol, which is also a depressant, you have a really profound risk of overdose. And the opioid crisis would be something that, ties in with this significantly, because if you have combination of different things that are calming down your overall system, you can run into danger very quickly. And withdrawal with anxiolytics also are very unpleasant, because there's this sense of a feeling of anxiety and insomnia, and in some cases even seizures. So that is going to push the person back into this addictive use. Then we come to opiates. And opiates are a category that has really garnered a lot of attention, particularly in the last decade. And opiates include prescription painkillers, illicit drugs like heroin, that act upon the body's opiate receptors. And these receptors are concentrated in areas associated with pain perception and reward. And this includes emotional pain. So when someone is on opiates, all their physical pain, all their emotional pain just goes away. And so who wouldn't want to live without that? Well, that causes this euphoria, but it also causes this release of dopamine into the brain's pathways and reinforces that pleasuring effect. And so that hijacks the decision-making emotional process that someone has. And so there's this, when you have particularly chronic opioid use, then there's also the tolerance, the necessity for higher doses, the dependence, and profound dangerous withdrawals if the opioid use is reduced or discontinued. And so the cycle of addiction is exacerbated through this process. And there's also tied in with this things like needle sharing that can go on, where you have that drug use compounded by risk of dangerous infections like HIV/AIDS or hepatitis. And then you also have that social isolation, that strained relationships, challenges with employment and academic pursuits, that all ties in with this as well. Then there are inhalants. And with inhalants, we have this kind of unique behavior of inhaling fumes or vapors. And this can have a specific neurobiological effects and some personal and social consequences. So this involves things like inhaling household products like glue or paint thinner or nitrous oxide. And this produces some rapid onset effects because it's directly into the brain by the inhalation process. And now the effects are going to be short-lived, but this also contributes to a pattern of repeat use. And the inhalants often depress the entire immune system, the entire central nervous system. And this leads to a feeling of euphoria, but you have the risk then of respiratory depression. And when you have respiratory depression, that is very dangerous because you need that in order to live. You need your respiratory system to be working well. And inhalants can also inhibit neurotransmitter function like GABA and glutamate, and this interferes with altered perception, with coordination, and can lead to altered perception, impaired coordination, and in some cases, a state of disassociation where you kind of feel like you're separated from yourself. And the physical consequences are profound with this. Damage to the brain, to the liver, to the kidneys, and other organs. and can lead very quickly to lifelong neurological damage, and there can even be sudden sniffing death where it induces heart failure in some individuals. And at the very least, it's going to lead to cognitive impairments affecting memory and attention and overall cognitive function. And this lack of cognitive impairment is going to have a lifelong impact upon educational pursuits, professional pursuits. It's going to lead to social isolation, strained relationships, and challenges in maintaining employment throughout life. And so it's something that is of huge detriment to society and obviously to the individual. Then there are hallucinogens. And hallucinogens such as LSD, psilocybin, what's found in certain mushrooms, primarily interact with serotonin receptors in the brain. And the interaction of these leads to altered states of mood and cognitive processes. Now, I want to kind of highlight something here, because there is something called microdosing, where in order to treat depression, and the New England Journal of Medicine and Dr. David Nutt, who is a leading addictions researcher and pharmacological researcher in the UK, has kind of highlighted this, that it can be beneficial for depression because depression is tied in with this serotonin system. But what we're talking about here is the use to induce hallucinations, and that level, how it can then hijack the system and hijack the brain's ability to process reality. Now, the subjective experience of this, of the use of hallucinations, is an altered sensory experiences, enhanced colors, distorted shapes, changes in perception. And so that's why sometimes it's called the psychedelic or mind-expanding drugs. But what can happen is that it can exacerbate some pre-existing mental health conditions. There are reports of spontaneous occurrences of flashbacks, and these can be experienced days, weeks, months after use. And there's an increased risk of accidents, because when you're in an altered state, you are not as aware of the environment and cannot interpret the environment accurately. And so that can cause significant problems as well. It's easy when you don't have a perception of reality to just walk out a window or something, and you don't realize what you're doing. Okay, then there's caffeine. You wouldn't normally think of caffeine as something that is a real problem, but it is a substance that can alter brain function, and caffeine functions as an adenosine receptor agonist. So adenosine is a kind of a relatively minor neurotransmitter that promotes relaxation and sleepiness, but by blocking that adenosine receptors, the caffeine increases alertness and energy. And so caffeine also stimulates the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. So there is this mild reward that goes on with the use of caffeine. And regular use of caffeine can lead to the development of tolerance, requiring higher doses in order to get the same stimulant effect. And this can have, as with anything, can have impact upon sleep disturbance, difficulty sleeping, sleep patterns, which can disrupt overall healthy functioning of the individual, and can again lead to this cycle of use within it. And so the thing that we need to kind of be mindful of is that caffeine is often embedded within social rituals, like having your breakfast coffee. And social behaviors around caffeine consumption can really influence an individual's habit and contribute to the pervasive use of it within society. And so we need to kind of be mindful that this can be a problem, and we need to be mindful of it. Then we all know of alcohol. Alcohol is one of those famous substance issues that every community seems to deal with. And alcohol primarily acts upon the GABA receptors of the brain, the gamma aminobutyric acid. And this leads to enhanced inhibitory transmission. So it has kind of a sedative effect and a sense of relaxation. And the alcohol also increases dopamine release in the reward pathway. So you get this double whammy of relaxation as well as a mild reward from the pleasurable effects. And in addition to that, you have enhanced inhibitory transmission. The alcohol inhibits the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate, which contributes to that depressant effect upon the immune system. And overall, the continued use of this, because you remember, alcohol is essentially a poison, it's going to lead to liver damage, some neurological damage, cardiovascular problems. You have your disruption of safe activities because of alcohol. You have an increased risk of violence because of alcohol, because it is impairing judgment and impulse control. It is also going to increase accidents and other criminal behavior. Then there is the teratogen effect of alcohol use, where a pregnant mother will drink alcohol and it will impact the development of a child, leading to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, which is a lifelong issue for the person that has inherited that disorder. There's also domestic violence, family disruptions. All of that is not to mention vehicle-related incidents tied in with alcohol. So alcohol really is a bane of society in many ways. And particularly, I want to kind of highlight the impacts having to do with fetal alcohol syndrome. So when you have alcohol consumption during pregnancy, that poses severe risk to fetal development. So this fetal alcohol syndrome is that constellation of physical and behavioral and cognitive abnormalities that result from the maternal use during pregnancy. And children with fetal alcohol syndrome are going to exhibit some specific facial abnormalities, growth deficiencies, and intellectual disabilities. The impact of the developing brain can lead to very lifelong challenges in learning and memory and social functioning. And there's very little that, you work to mitigate all of this, but all it would take to avoid all of those problems is just to not drink during pregnancy. And then there's the risk of violence with alcohol use. Any other drug that caused the level of violence would be controlled immensely more than alcohol is. Alcohol impairs judgment. It increases aggression. It contributes to higher likelihoods of violent incidents. In social celebrations, when alcohol is present, there absolutely needs to be someone there to intervene with what will be the inevitable violence that is going to break out, because alcohol misuse is associated with also criminal behavior, ranging from public disturbances to very serious offenses. And that's not to mention the impaired driving that is a major contributor to road accidents and fatalities, because alcohol impairs coordination, reaction time, decision making, all of which is going to increase the likelihood of vehicle accidents. So overall, there's a huge public concern around alcohol, and that has a profound societal impact. Okay, then there's cannabis. Cannabis is compounds like tetrahydrocannabinol, so THC, and this activates the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. And these receptors are part of the endocannabinoid system, and those play a role in things like mood and appetite and reward. And so THC, which is the psychoactive component of cannabis, increases dopamine levels, so you get this reward. It contributes to pleasurable effects and reinforces the desire for it. And there's also development of tolerance and dependence. And cannabis use is really subject to some varying legal frameworks globally. While it is strongly controlled in the United States, there are many other parts of the world where the control is being reduced. Some of the issues around cannabis have to do with things like, for example, with anything to do with smoking would have to do with respiratory issues. There's also driving impairment, which can be a significant problem because there's impairment in coordination and attention and reaction time. And the overall impact on mental health as well, because it's impacting significantly the dopamine system. It is associated in some cases with schizophrenic symptoms. Not to say that it causes schizophrenia, but when you have this imbalance going on, it can have a profound impact on those that have a predisposition to things like schizophrenia or anxiety disorders. And I want to just kind of highlight a little bit, because of where we're located, the difference in legislation between Canada and the United States and the attitudes towards it. Now, in 2018, Canada legalized cannabis, and so people can possess cannabis. You can go and purchase it at special stores and outlets. Whereas in the United States, in many states, and it's banned federally, but in many states it is banned. And now in some states, they have legalized some recreational use, as well as permitting it for certain medical use, but it's still federally classified as a controlled substance. Now, legalization in Canada has contributed, some would argue, to economic growth and job creation, as well as increased tax revenue for the drug, as well as the reduction of the impact of criminal processing of cannabis use. So there's some argument there that because it's not something that you would typically associate with, say for example, overdoses and things like that, like opiates would be, that some people argue that it should be legalized. I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just pointing out that there are societal differences in and legal differences from place to place on the view of cannabis. And then finally, I just want to kind of highlight as we end this lecture, that the thing that we need to kind of keep in mind is that there is a profound neurobiological component to addiction. And that a lot of that has to do with a disruption of the neurotransmitters that impact the feeling state of the individual. And because our decision-making processes are based largely upon our feeling states, when that feeling state is hijacked by the substance, our decision-making process is also hijacked by it. And when you combine that with subtle neurological damage that is caused by the disorder, as well as the other societal damage that is caused by it, you can see that addictions are a very serious issue that we need to deal with and treat seriously. And that's it for our lecture this week. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Goodbye.